Hello and welcome back to the neighborhood. Whether it's your first time here or you've been with us since the beginning, thank you so much for listening. On this episode, we're taking a look at that special kind of game that lives between indie and AAA. That's right, we're talking about AA video games. Welcome to the podcast where two longtime friends and sometimes a guest talk about their favorite games from the perspective of an average player. My name is Andrew Kimball.
And I'm Wren, and we are your friendly neighborhood gamers.
Dylan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. Glad I could be a recurring guest here.
Yeah. It's nice to have you in the rotation.
Been talking a lot about PlayStation and Nintendo games, which are neither of my specialties. So,
right. Yeah. Sometimes it just works out that way with scheduling.
Yep.
Sometimes, it's just like, well, I could come on there and be like, I have played a Mario game before, but maybe I'll just sit this one out.
Yeah. I don't know that I could really claim that. I think the Super Mario RPG, or Mario RPG, what is it? The Thousand Year Door. That's like the only
Mario.
That one, Paper Mario and Thousand Year Door is like the only Mario game I've put more than 30 minutes into. So, and Kart, I guess Mario Kart.
I was going to say, aside from like the offshoots like
Yeah.
Mario Kart, Mario Party. Yeah.
The platformers, not for me.
Probably there will be some games in this topic category that are for you, where,
Yes.
like I mentioned before the intro, we're talking about AA games. So what are AA games? They are mid-market video games that typically have some type of professional development, but it's usually outside of the large first-party studios or the major developers. AA studios tend to range from about 50 to 100 people in size and will typically be backed by a publisher, but not fundamentally part of that publisher. Thus, they have a little bit more freedom to innovate and experiment compared to AAA studios. However, some will still be constrained by specific risk-limiting targets and goals from their funding source. AA games will sometimes be priced lower than their AAA counterparts. Some examples of games considered to be AA titles include It Takes Two, A Plague Tale: Innocence, and Sifu. So we thought it would be fun to take this category, this topic, and kind of pick it apart. AA games are near and dear to my heart. I tend to dabble in a lot of them, and every now and then a few will just like stick with me and rise to the top of my like favorite games of all times list. Like I mentioned a Plague Tale: Innocence in that description, and that's a game that just played on a whim, got it on like deep discount, figured why not try it out, and ended up really loving it. And then there's some AA games that are just, they're a fun way to spend a week or whatever. They didn't really set the world on fire, but I kind of want to kick this thing off just with like the question of what makes them special? What makes like the AA game category unique?
Yeah. I know you've kind of put a few things in the doc here.
Yeah.
And so one of the first ones that you would put in was that since they have less budget, they have to focus on what matters. So not as much bloat and hopefully a more like solid gameplay loop. And that was the one that to me, I think stuck out the most as like, I think this is the key of it for me. I think like personally, I feel like a lot of the bigger games, not that I'm saying they don't have, creative vision, that they don't have, this or that, because they do. And there are a lot of fantastic AAA games. But at the same time, it does feel like a lot of the AAA games are being created to appeal to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And that's fine. that's, like that makes sense. Similar to like how a Marvel movie is kind of made, or at least they were made to kind of be like appealing to the most amount of people. And that's not, I don't want this to sound like I'm knocking, a big AAA game, because they are great. But at the same time, I think there's a lot that it does where it's just kind of like, well, this is not every game needs to have a big open world. Not every game needs to have a crafting system. Not every game needs to have live service components. Not every game needs to have, this, that, or the other. And so I think a lot of times when you've got, when you're trying to make a game for everyone, stuff gets watered down, stuff gets bloated, like you were kind of, put in this doc. And a AA game doesn't have the time or money or resources to do that. They have to kind of pick an audience and be like, we want to make a really good game for this particular subset of people. And, I'm sure there's a lot more that goes into it. I'm sure they do some research on like how big is the subset of people, because obviously,
right.
They can't just make a game for Dylan or for Andrew, because that's, $70 or less. And, that's their one sale. But like Souls-likes, they go hard for that Souls-like audience, like Liza P, they knew who they were targeting. They knew what they were doing. It's a smaller, more compact game. It doesn't do as, it's not a big open world like Elden Ring. It doesn't do as many crazy things like Elden Ring. It doesn't have a crafting system. I don't think. Does it?
Not crafting. Okay. It has like the weapons stuff, but not like a straight up crafting system like what they put in Elden Ring.
And so they like targeted that, and like they made a fantastic game for that audience. Plague Tale is another one that you mentioned where, it's not got a big, it could have easily fallen into like the more Assassin's Creed-y type of open world craziness. But instead it is a much more concise, like, here is a linear story that is, being told through these levels, and they have little stealth sections, and they have, light exploration and that sort of thing, but it's nothing compared to, like, it's not God of War.
No, yeah, like Plague Tale, I feel like it's easy to draw comparisons to the AAA counterparts for a lot of these games, which is something that I like about AA games. You mentioned Souls-likes. If you're waiting for that next big FromSoft hit, there's a bunch of smaller studios out there making games that can kind of tide you over. Occasionally you get one that's just like immaculately done like Liza P, but a lot of times you get your Steel Risings, you get the Surge, you get
that one where you can be a suit of armor.
Yeah, you get Mortal Shell, you get what's the most recent one that I'm like waiting to be patched so that I can finally play it? Lords of the Fallen.
Lords of the Fallen.
Yeah, you get Lords of the Fallen. You get all these kind of offshoots, and some of them have become series of their own. Like, people generally really like the Surge 2, and people like the new Lords of the Fallen, with the exception of mostly technical stuff. So it's like some of these games have found like a name for themselves, but it's the same thing with like Plague Tale. You can kind of compare it gameplay wise, is very Last of Us, but completely different like setting and story that they're telling.
Yeah.
But sometimes you get AA games that lean more towards the indie side, the kind of wacky side, and that line gets a little bit blurry. Yeah. Of like, is this an indie game? Is it a AA game? What is that line? Especially when indie doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's more of an idea or a feeling.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I was doing my research for this, which is pretty much just like scrolling through Reddit and seeing what they thought of AA games so that I could maybe find some sparks of like inspiration for potential like little topics we could talk about here. What I learned was that if it was a game put out by like a big studio or a game that people didn't like, AA was kind of an insult, like a slur. They were like, oh, this is just a AA game. But if it was a game that people really liked, it was a compliment. Like, can you believe a AA game did this? And it was kind of like if a AAA game was bad, they called it a AA game. But if an indie game was good, they called it a AA game. So it was a little bit of a weird, like, dynamic there. It seemed like the internet, surprise, didn't really have a concise and agreed upon definition of what this was. Also, apparently AA games have been dying for the past 14 years. So
yeah, well, AAA games are unsustainable every year, so we keep hearing. Then eventually, if you keep saying something, it could come true and you'll be able to say you were right. But
yeah, like Microsoft bought Activision, you know?
It is kind of interesting how there are ebbs and flows in like the industry. And, you know, this is a bullet point I kind of had later, but there was a time where indies just weren't that prevalent. Yeah. And then all of a sudden they just like boomed. And I feel like we're still in indie boom. Like we're getting really good, solid indie games. Every year there's at least a handful of indie darlings. Like, did you play... I almost said Dave the Diver just to bring that whole thing back around. But yeah. It's like, did you play... you know, we had Celeste was one that comes to mind. Hades, obviously. Yeah. There, over the past few years, let's see, last year was I remember people talking about indie games. We didn't see them, I feel like, recognized as much just because there were so many like bigger games that came out. But like, what was the puzzle game you played?
Cocoon was on there. Dredge was on there.
Dredge.
Sea of Stars was on there.
We got Blasphemous 2 last year. Yeah, Sea of Stars. So like indie games are in quite a boom. And for a while, it really felt like probably around the time when I started podcasting, we were just barely coming out of where it was indie or AAA. Like those are your options. There wasn't a lot worth playing in that kind of in-between space. And now it kind of feels like that swung the other way. And I think part of that is because indie studios have access to a lot more powerful tools now. So they can make games that feel bigger than an indie, even though they're a small studio. Like Mortal Shell, for example, was made by a very small team, is probably technically an indie game, but it has like a AA feel because it's a full 3D realized. You know, it's a longer experience. It feels like it could stand and like hold its own against other Souls-likes. Even though technically, if you wanted to categorize things literally, it's probably an indie game.
Yeah, because it definitely seems like in my mind, I kind of delineate like, okay, indies are, you know, the pixel graphics, or indies are like the 2D side scrollers, or, you know, that sort of thing. And I know that that's not.
So would you put because I saw this I was looking up like articles about like popular indie games or whatever, just to kind of refresh in my mind, similar to you, like what does the industry consider indie games? And I saw games on there like Overcooked.
Yeah.
Is that a AA game? Because I think indie when I see Overcooked.
Yeah, like it's not a perfect one-to-one because like Overcooked is there, but also Overcooked does have kind of like a goofy art style. I guess like indie, when I'm looking at a game, and like I said, I know that this is not accurate because really,
it's all feelings.
Yeah, it's the vibes you get. Like if it's got like kind of a goofy art style, if it's got a little quirky thing, or if it's like pixel graphics or a 2D side scroller, I immediately am like indie game. Even though I know that that's not true because like the very definition is independent studio not getting funding from like, you know, someone else or whatever. Whereas AA oftentimes can be the same studios, but they're just getting more money kicked to them via like Helldivers 2, I think is technically like a AA game published by Sony. Like Sony put it out pretty much. But that studio itself, I think, is like an independent studio. They just had a contract to do Helldivers 2 with Sony. That is maybe like a better definition of AA in my mind, but also like when I look at a game, I'm like, I don't know though. Like Helldivers 2 seems kind of good. So I don't know. Like it's It is and I think you're right about sort of the ebbs and flows too, because like to me, I think I attribute it to like console generations. Like I think we've been in an indie boom because of the Switch. Like I think the Switch has made previously, I think most indies ended up just kind of coming to PC, which inherently kind of, like they are kind of one of the biggest groups of gamers out there behind mobile games. But for us, we are way more plugged into like the console side of things. So I think there were just a ton of indie games we didn't pay attention to or hear about because they were only available on PC. Versus once Switch came out, it got way easier to hear about them because there were so many more coming to Switch, even if that was
it was like console. PC and Switch. Yeah.
Plus, like you were kind of saying too, I think the tools out there have gotten so much better so that it's a whole lot easier to port games between all three consoles if that's something that they wanted to do. And I think some of that comes with like just where we are in the console generation. I think you see that sort of AA indie boom console wise, a few years into a console's lifespan, because at that point, a lot of developers have kind of figured out the workings of whatever it is their console, and so it becomes a lot easier, I think, to just develop a game for that. It's still a very hard process, I'm sure, but I think it seems like generally at the beginning of a console's life cycles, it's usually like just the big developers putting stuff out, and smaller stuff too is coming, but usually it's kind of like, yeah, we can maybe upscale some of the graphics for like a release that was coming for last gen sort of thing.
Yeah, and I don't know, there's a lot of factors into like the point I'm about to try and make. It's partially me being more plugged in, but I think it's also just the amount of quality indie games and AA's have increased, but also the kind of appreciation and recognition from the community and industry has grown a lot too. Because I remember in the 360 days, like there was a big push by Microsoft to kind of give indies a platform. You had your Castle Crashers, and you had their they call it like ID at Xbox now, but it had a different name back, like Summer of Indies or
it was Summer of Indies, and I think they initially called it like Indie Arcade or something like that.
Yeah, Indie Arcade, that's what it was. Yeah. And so you had like a push there, but I remember not really caring about any of those games back then, which, partially was me and where I was at as a gamer, but was now it's like, it feels like indies are a much larger part of the conversation. When we're talking about game of the year, it's not uncommon for a Sea of Stars or a Dredge or something to be brought up in the conversation, and nobody bats an eye.
An indie won game of the year for 2023, like Baldur's Gate. So
right.
It is technically an indie.
Yeah.
It is technically kind of a AA game. I mean, it is a AAA game in my book, but where does that fit into this ranking system?
Baldur's Gate, is a very interesting one. I mean, I guess, all that to say is like, I guess kind of where I started with this point was that now I feel like we're at the point where there's a plentiful amount of AA games, and I love a lot of like big, high produced AAA video games. Obviously The Witcher 3. I love the Spider-Man games. Like is
The Witcher indie?
Technically I think they're not, because CD Projekt Red is being published by like CD Projekt or something, their parent company, but it's all the same company. Yeah. So it's kind of weird.
Yeah. They're not one of like the big, EA, Ubisoft, Microsoft, PlayStation, Nintendo, but they are still big enough.
Well, yeah, and they're not big in the sense that they put out that volume of games, but they are big in the sense that like they own GOG.
Yeah.
Like they're a big company making lots of money, but you don't think of them as one of those like prevalent like publishers in the way that you think of like a Ubisoft or a Activision or whatever back before Microsoft bought them. But every once in a while I love to just sit down for a probably no more than 20-hour experience where the focus of this game was the gameplay and that maybe like one or two other like key components to like what is our game. Our game is going to be this setting. It's going to have this combat system, and you're going to do arena fights, and then you're going to do a little bit of exploration, and then you're going to do some more arena fights, and then you're going to like level up a little bit as it goes so that you feel more powerful. And that's Evil West, which was a game that I had a ton of fun with. I thought it looked cool, but it was one of those games where it was like wait for the right time to actually sit down and play it. And when I did, I pretty much just played nothing else until I had finished it. And it was just like a really, saying junk food game sounds a little bit like derogative, but I mean that in a good way. It was like, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to snack on this thing and I'm going to enjoy it. And then towards the end, I'm going to get a little bit like, okay, we maybe could have trimmed a little bit off the back here, but for the most of the experience, I'm just going to be having fun and not giving a crap about the lore or the world or the story. Yeah. I'm just like having fun playing the gameplay. And I mean, a game that everybody compares Evil West to, Remnant 2, that was another kind of AA game that we had a lot of fun with last year.
Well, it's nice to not every game has to be this big thinky like masterpiece. Like, don't get me wrong, I love those as well. I would love to sit down and just experience Mass Effect again. Yeah. But at the same time, it's a big, long game that you have to pay attention to because it's, got a bunch of story interwoven into it. And sometimes it's nice to just kind of, for lack of a better word, just like have like pig out on sort of the like, or the junk food, like you said, where it's just kind of like, yeah, the story is fine, but also it's not like I'm having to think too hard about this. It's the gameplay is good. I'm not having to necessarily like, not that you can't do that. Like Lies of P definitely required you to like be tuned into like what you were doing. But I think there's something to be said for like the games that are just like, we've talked about it a bunch of times before, but just like a good game, and I think that's another one of those things that makes some like these games special. And I don't know if it's like a bias that just as gamers we tend to have, where it's like we don't have the same expectations of most of these like AA games that we do. If the new Gears of War came out, everybody would have like, because it is a big AAA Microsoft published thing, there are expectations of what that game is going to be. And if it doesn't live up to the hype, people are going to trash it. And it's still going to be a pretty good game. But also, if a AA studio put out a 10-hour Gears of War-esque type of game with a goofy fun story and, crazy combat that was all very solid, I think a lot of people would play the same game. Like if that was functionally the same game as like a new Gears of War, I think people would view that one way more favorably versus like same with Lies of P. If Lies of P was the next From Software game, would it have gotten the same praise as it did? And if the answer is no, then, is that some of our just like implicit bias against like, we have these really high expectations of the big publishers, but then when a AA publisher comes along or AA developer comes along and makes a good fun game, we're like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah, I think kind of jumping off that point too, another thing that I really like about playing AA games is knowing very little about them, and then there's a lot more room to be surprised. We get so few weird and new like triple A games. Like that's why Death Stranding is such a weird, interesting experiment in the gaming space, because it's like an indie idea with a triple A budget. And so like I don't know anything about Plague Tale. I started up And next thing I know, I'm just like blown away because it surprised me. So same thing with Evil West. Like I had seen a trailer or two, but like getting into the game, it was like, oh wow, this is like really solid and fun to play.
Yeah.
Whereas in the AAA space, we're either anticipating something so much that we're like consuming everything we can about it before it comes out.
Yeah.
Or it's part of a series like Spider-Man 2. It felt like more Spider-Man because it was more Spider-Man. And so there's something just kind of nice about being able to like dive into a AA game that you maybe heard the name of. Like there's a game coming out. It's that like Last Berserker game. And I watched the trailer for that the other day because it popped up on the Xbox dashboard, and I immediately wishlisted it. I was like, this looks incredible.
Yeah. I remember like that happened to me too, and I remembered seeing it at some sort of like maybe it was the Game Awards where they showed it the first time, and I was like, oh, this looks pretty cool. And then I had forgotten about it, and then it popped up on the dashboard, which is I guess another thing too. I feel like the discoverability of AA's has gotten so much better. Not all of them have the budget to do a big, huge marketing push, but and like I'm sure that the Last Berserker or whatever paid money to Microsoft to like put it on the dashboard somewhere. But I think it's gotten easier to do that way more recently. And I think just like discoverability, at least in Microsoft's store, is pretty good. Like I think they do a good job of sort of curate, like here's the new games, here are upcoming games. And I think they do a good job of not having just like the insane amount of bloat that comes with like Nintendo's store. And it's also not frustrating to navigate the menus like PlayStation Store. And so I think it is a lot easier for that and for like Steam to like serve you better ads for it and help you discover it. Plus, you know, services like Game Pass and PlayStation Plus, I think do a great job. You know, a lot of times they'll put some indie or some AA games or some indie games on there. And I think that was, you know, previously one of the parts that was maybe why they seem like they've maybe blown up more is because, you know, if I had the choice to buy, you know, a big new AAA game or this AA game that I knew nothing about, I was probably going to get the AAA game.
100%.
But now, you know, if I see a AA game that looks interesting on Game Pass, it's like, yeah, well, I'll install it, you know, might as well try it out. Right. Or, you know, I get on and check like the deals of the week every week in the Microsoft store. And so it's like, if I had heard, you know, somebody on a podcast be like, oh, hey, this AA game's pretty cool. You know, I'd scroll through that. And if I saw it on sale for like $20, it's like, maybe I'll pick that up, try it out. So I think it's gotten way easier to find these games than maybe it was in the past as well.
I think PlayStation Plus and Game Pass, and those two specifically for console, are huge. I mean, think about Game Pass. Games like Plague Tale Requiem, Hi-Fi Rush, Lies of P. I mean, those are just three right there. There are so many games that either launch on that platform, and it's like, yeah, let me go ahead and dive in and play this day one. Or if they don't, they come to it later, like Remnant 2 came to it later. I'm sure there are just a ton that I'm forgetting because I don't actually have it pulled up in front of me. But like I'm thinking about, you mentioned Helldivers, and everybody's hyped about Helldivers, and it looks really cool. And it's one of those games that I've like felt the FOMO and been like, it's even like discount pricing, like not discount, but just like it's a $40 game instead of $70, just like brand new. But trying to be better with my budget and, you know, be a little bit more responsible with spending money. And I knew Final Fantasy Rebirth was right around the corner, and I knew I was going to buy that day one and play it. Yeah. So I haven't bought Helldivers 2, Whereas if it had come to Game Pass, I'd be playing it.
Yep.
Or a PlayStation Plus or something. So like, granted, they would rather probably get me to spend the $40, but if they can get me in, and I get hooked, then it's like, well, then maybe, when it leaves the service, I'll pick it up, or maybe I'll spend some money on cosmetics or whatever they have, depending on the type of game.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'll play a game like Lies of P, for example. It's kind of a bad example because I was already excited about it, but let's just say play a game like Lies of P and be like, wow, this is incredible. If the sequel comes out and is not on Game Pass, there's a really good chance I'm going to go ahead and just buy it when it comes out because I want to see like what that game, how they improve on the gameplay, and also like where they're going to go in this kind of ridiculous world they've set up.
Yeah. Even when like the DLC comes out, like if the game itself is still on Game Pass whenever they release like their DLC, it's like, I'll drop $10-15, pick up the DLC, play through that,
Yep.
Or, if it happens to go off right before the DLC comes out, that's even more reason to be like, well, let me just pick up this like Ultimate Edition that has the main game and the DLC bundled in it for, $50 or whatever. So
kind of going back to what I was talking about with like AAA games being kind of a known quantity. It's like, even when they're good, you kind of know what you're getting. And so it's fun to find a new thing to be a fan of. And I feel like you reach a certain point in fandoms with like, for me, this happens to music where I feel like I have heard all of the good bands in the genre that I enjoy. And anytime I like branch out from my like known bands, it's either like anytime some algorithm tries to put an I Prevail song in front of me, I'm like, ugh, get this trash out of here. I don't want to hear I Prevail. I already know I don't like them. Give me something that's actually new. But because I've listened to so much like rock and metal music already, very rarely do I find a new band and go, oh wow, that's awesome, I've never heard it before, and now I want to go like download their whole back catalog. And then like when I first discovered the Amity Affliction, that was what happened to me. It was like, I've never heard of these guys before, but they're really good, and I'm just gonna like listen to nothing but them for the next however many months. And I feel like that happens with games too. Like we get excited when the new release from the thing we know comes out, like Elden Ring, God of War, whatever franchise you like. But it's less like common, I feel like, where you find something new that you fall in love with to that level. Like a lot of times I'll play games between like the stuff that I know I'm going to love. I'll try this thing out, or I'll try that thing out, and I'll like it. But like I tried to get back into Devil May Cry when I was in kind of a gaming lull, and I was having a good time with it, but I'm not like a diehard Devil May Cry fan now. It's not like one of my favorite franchises. So it's exciting when something like a Plague Tale comes along, and it's just like, wow, this is incredible. And it's one of those games that like I genuinely love and will recommend to anybody that I see or meet on the street and be like, hey, have you ever heard of Plague Tale? You should try it.
Yeah.
And that, I feel like that's a lot more likely to happen if you're kind of dabbling in that AA space where you either have these studios that are trying to become AAA, and so they're like on their way up, or you just find this kind of like niche janky thing that you love.
Yeah, well, and I think your music analogy was a good one too, of just kind of like, if you listen to insert genre here, like you've probably got like, this is probably a band that you have heard of, or whatever. And so it's like, oh, okay, like, yeah, you've probably heard like you said, if you listen to metal right now, like you've probably heard of August Burns Red, because they're a big name in the scene. But it's like, well, what about all those other, bands that are kind of around that? Same thing, I think, with, like it probably applies to any sort of medium art, like,
yeah.
You like, this kind of, like, you like fantasy movies. You've probably heard of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
but
probably.
But there are all these other smaller fantasy titles that maybe you haven't gone and watched, or
have you seen Willow?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, like, yeah, there's a lot of I agree with you on sort of that idea of like, it's nice to go into something and not have been beaten over the head with like 47 different trailers, to not have it like, don't get me wrong, I still love Elden Ring, but we were seeing that game for like 3 years before it came out. And we've been seeing the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC for about 2-3 years since, like,
Yeah, it's kind of a weird like enigma though, because FromSoft will still find ways to surprise us. Like we did not expect, I did not expect Elden Ring to be as big as it was and like do the stuff it did. So
yeah, I mean,
there are still surprises in the AAA. Yeah.
It's FromSoft, so that, they're still definitely going to surprise you because that's like their whole thing. But
what's that game that you absolutely love that you're almost always playing, where you're going into the swamp and fighting nightmares and trying to get out alive while other players are sniping at you?
Hunt Showdown.
Yeah, Hunt Showdown. That's like a good AA game that you just kind of tried on a whim because you heard people talking about it and you're like, well, I'll try it. And now it's like one of your favorite games. Yeah.
Like super solid, a lot of fun. And, it wasn't necessarily like what I was expecting or what I didn't really have an idea going into it of like, oh, it's going to be like this. And I think that's a nice space to be in. Or, like if you like a specific thing, and we've already kind of touched on this, there are other things in that genre that you can kind of go to, like Souls-likes for you. You can play other Souls-likes that are not going to be as good. Like I like sort of the cosmic horror, like Lovecraftian stuff. And so like there are a bunch of like AA games that like do stuff with that. Big AAA games, you're basically like Bloodborne and maybe some light themes in some of the other games.
Right.
But
did you see they're doing a sequel to Sinking City?
I did see that they're doing a sequel to Sinking City too, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, I saw that and I was like, I bet Dylan's excited. Moving on.
Yes. Like I am very excited for that game. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, where it's like, a nice AA like detective Lovecraftian thing.
That's a really good point though, where it's you can find things in that space that like you're just not being served in the AAA space. Like how you can't really find so much of that like Lovecraftian that theme in a lot of AAA games, but in the AA space, if you want to put up with a little jank and maybe some silliness, some lower budget, you can find things in that theme that you enjoy. That's a good point.
Yeah, like if all you like is generic military man shooters, you probably don't need to look outside of the AAA space. You can just buy your Call of Duty every year and move on. But if you have like an interest in, I think Baldur's Gate is another good example of just kind of like, oh, if you have played Baldur's Gate and you have found that you really like sort of the almost like TTRPG, CRPG type of game, there are so many of those in the AA space that you can now check out, because that is where those games live. XCOM is another that comes to mind. Like XCOM is maybe like sort of the big example. But if you are willing to check out some AA stuff, there's, 3 or 4 other like AA games of that style that you can go take a look at.
I downloaded this game called Other Side. Have you heard of it?
I have.
It's like real like red and black color palette, and it's like a turn-based game, but you're like a squad of women fighting for like the mother or something.
I have seen like the trailer or something for it, or I can visualize the box, but I'm like, why do I know that? Why have I looked at that?
Yeah, so. It's what you're talking about, of like a AA kind of like really weird take on that sort of turn-based strategy. I haven't started it yet. I've had it like in my it's installed. I just haven't ever pulled the trigger on it because I'm like, I've heard it's really difficult is really why I'm like, I have to be ready to like sweat, or maybe I could just drop it to like super easy baby mode. But yeah, it's an example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Like there are some that don't work as well. Like I don't feel like we get a lot of superhero games in like the AA space. I don't feel like.
Yeah, because you're looking for that spectacle. You're looking to see your character get thrown across New York City and, you know, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit tougher to have a more, I mean, would Midnight Suns be kind of in that AA space, or do you feel like that's AAA?
I'd say Midnight Suns probably AA. I forget who published it. It's probably not. It's like Firaxis.
Firaxis, yeah. And then there was a Marvel vs. Capcom 3 for the Switch, which, again, probably technically not AA, but definitely not that like AAA vibe that you get from your Arkham games or your Spider-Man games or Marvel's Avengers.
Yeah.
Suicide Squad.
Yeah, I was going to say that AAA experience that is the Suicide Squad game.
Yeah, sometimes
Gotham Knights.
Sometimes that's another thing that can be nice about AA, and we've kind of touched on this, but like if the industry is veering hard towards a specific gameplay model that either you don't vibe with or just doesn't seem to work, like they seem to be doing right now with live service games. I mean, kind of Helldivers is another good example of that, where when the industry is pushing one way, Helldivers just like released their thing at a different price point with a different business model and focused on different aspects, and it was a big success. Sometimes you can find either that thing that you miss, which I think is a lot of it too. I think a lot of AA games now are playing into that, either, hey, it's taken a long time for you to get that next Souls-like that you really want, so we're going to try to make one. Or B, like Evil West is a perfect example of this. You remember how fun video games were on the 360? You remember how carefree your life was? You remember how it was just a pure like video game experience. Like video games were video games. They weren't trying to be art. They weren't trying to be movies. They couldn't be movies. It wasn't possible. Here's a game like that. You remember this? And you're like, wow, I do remember this. This takes me back to when all I had to do was clock out at Walmart and then go home and play Saints Row 3 all night long. and it's kind of like, I feel like a lot of AA games go to, like, aim to recapture that feeling, but they do it in a way where like it feels like a modern game. It's just like paying homage or focusing on the things that like the games of that era focused on.
Yeah. When I think a AAA game comes out, like it's already, even if it's not good, it's already guaranteed to sell a ton of copies. You know, like Spider-Man 2 was always going to sell a ton of copies regardless of whether it was good or not. You know, like
right.
It sounds like the jury has come back and said, yeah, it's fine. But, you know, it was always going to sell a ton of games because it's Spider-Man, right? Versus, you know, your AA's where it's like you have to like to sell, you have to be fun, you know? You don't necessarily have the license to lean on. You don't necessarily have the like brand recognition that like a first party PlayStation game or Nintendo game has coming out. You're also not going to get like the reviewer suck up bump from your review scores for just being a Nintendo game. And so like you have to be a better game to like get better review scores. And so like,
I mean, you'll probably get a 7 or an 8 from IGN either way, but
That's true. But you're not going to get an automatic 10 because you're a PlayStation game from IGN, you know? To me, it seems like they have to focus more on that fun, you know, like it has to be a solid, fun game, because the ones that we've already talked about, like ones that we would recommend to people, it's like the gameplay, good, you know, the gameplay, fun. We enjoy playing the game, and like, you know, the story of Plague Tale is also really good. And so it's just kind of like, hey, check this game out, because it benefits way more from like word of mouth and, people saying, hey, this is a really fun game, you should check it out, versus, a game that, is Mario, where it's already going to sell 1 billion copies because it's Mario. And it's going to sell them at $70 a pop because it's not going to go on sale. So
sometimes they're $5 off. Or sometimes Nintendo will let you buy 2 games at once and they'll give you like $10 off.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Slow down there. Slow down there, Nintendo. People might start expecting games to be $60.
Yeah. That kind of leads into like, do you think we will see, like we talked about the ebb and flow, do you think that we will see AA games continue to rise as AAA games seem to take longer and longer and longer to develop and also are now costing more? I think of like that Banisher's New Eden game that just came out, and that's one that I want to play at some point. That is kind of what I think of when I think of like a AA game.
Yeah.
And I think AA games are starting to blur into AAA in some cases because, you have such tools coming out like Unreal 5 and things like that where developers can make a bigger, kind of more high production product for the same amount of effort as they were before. But it still has those like same kind of markings of a AA game of just like, oh yeah, I can see where like you didn't have the extra 100 people here to maybe blow this system out like you wanted to or whatever. Like they still feel like
the voice acting.
They feel simpler and like smaller in scope than some of these AAA games. And I think when we're looking at, God only knows when we'll see the next CD Projekt Red game, you're looking at the development time between, Xbox, we're just now starting to see some of these games come to fruition that they've been talking about since they bought all of these studios. So it's just like, it seems like the AAA space, we're getting some incredible experiences and some like really high production experiences, but the time between them really seems like it's growing. Whereas like these AA games, harkening back again to that like 360 era, it was like on the Xbox 360, it was maybe a couple years between entries in your series. Like we talk about Gears of War. How many Gears games came out on the 360 in the time between Gears 5 and we still don't have Gears 6? Like if you take that same
like
amount of time, it was like an entire trilogy and a spin-off. So I think AA games can kind of fill that gap of like releases coming out. And so in my mind, I think that with the fact that the tools they have access to are only allowing them to make better and more kind of like high production looking products, and also just with the way AAA is going, I could see even some of these bigger studios either leaning into AA type experiences to kind of fill in their portfolios as they work on the next big thing, or just releasing like a short high production thing like Insomniac is doing with like Miles Morales and stuff, where it's like, this is the same Spider-Man gameplay. Like we didn't dumb it down at all, but the game's like 8 hours long.
Yeah. Cause I definitely think that, especially in light of like recent developments, there has been a trend of just like a fewer, like maybe 4 or 5 games in a row that have kind of taken the zeitgeist and been like, hey, guess what? When you make a fun game, it's okay if it's not like this big expansive thing, it's okay if it's not this big AAA thing. Like I think you saw that with Lies of P. I think you saw that with Baldur's Gate. I think you saw that with like, again, Baldur's Gate is like a weird spot because, but even their previous stuff, Divinity, Original Sin, like that series, was still very good, very solid games. I think you saw it with Helldivers. I think you even saw it with like Palworld, where like these are all smaller experiences, more targeted in like what they are doing, and cheaper for the most part, like even Baldur's Gate, I think, is not $70. I think it's like 60 for the game. I could be wrong on that. It might be 70 for like the deluxe. Anyway, but I think you've seen like this run of like, okay, Helldivers, like it's a $40 game that's got really fun, really solid gameplay. We don't need this big, long campaign. We don't need this big, long, like we don't need you to be able to fly your ship to different worlds. We don't need to do all this other stuff. It's like the gameplay loop is solid. So I do think you'll see more studios doing that just because like that is where the creativity is. Not that these big AAA games are not creative, but also they're kind of not being that creative. So I do think you'll see way more of that in coming years. And it's like you said, the tools are there. Services like Game Pass are there to, if you can make a really solid looking AA game that gets some hype behind it, there's a good chance Microsoft and Sony are going to show up at your door saying, hey, can we give you some money already, like before it even comes out, to put it on our service when it launches, And so I think we will see more of that just because it's getting easier to do. It's getting safer to do. And I think it would be nice if some of these bigger, like you kind of see it with Microsoft, like Hellblade. I think the original Hellblade was a AA game,
Yeah, for sure.
So you do kind of see them mixing in some like AA, like Hi-Fi Rush, like those kind of experiences with their big, first party, like Avowed and that sort of stuff. I don't know what Sony will do because I'm not like really an expert on like the goings on in their side of things, but it seems to me that like Xbox is going that way, like similar to like Netflix, where it's like, yeah, they've got their Stranger Things, but then they've also got, like 5 other series that are not as big or good as
Right.
Stranger Things, but a lot of people still have fun with them. It's a reason to go to the service. It's something that you watch while you're waiting for the next season of Stranger Things to come out. It's the reason you don't cancel.
Yeah. Something else to think about when talking about like AA's filling the gaps or like becoming more prevalent as like over the next few years is like you see all these studios, and I'm sure every studio story is different, but there's 100% a trend happening right now, and it sucks for the people that are affected by it, but so many studios like overreached or were too ambitious, or their live service games failed or whatever. And with all the layoffs and things that are happening and like the downsizing of like massive names, big names in the industry, like heavy hitters, big players, and with them like cutting back, and it feels like we're in kind of a period of transition, of change, of like what the industry is going to be focusing on. Like right now it won't feel it because things move slow when you're a big like corporation like that, and it takes time to like make the games. But I bet like in 5 years from now we're going to see different gaming trends based on the fact that we had this gold rush to live service that failed. We had the COVID years where gaming spiked, and all these like studios and publishers like just staffed up like crazy, and now they're having to cut a lot of those people away because things failed or whatever. They're not hitting their unrealistic targets. Who knows? Everybody's like I said, their situations are probably slightly different, but I think all of that kind of coming to a head right now is also going to be where you're going to see either these now kind of refocused and smaller studios and publishers kind of focus in on, okay, what more sustainable ideas do we have? But you're also going to see like these other studios like NeoWiz or whatever that you've never heard of before come in and be like, well, we have this game.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of them might be from countries trying to, because like, what is that Wukong, Black Myth Wukong? Like that's another one that looks crazy good coming from a studio that we've never really heard of out of China. So it's like, I think that we're in a a time of transition right now. And I think part of that
Yeah.
transition will be in the short term, some of these smaller experiences filling the gaps as the industry figures itself out, but also just maybe a normalization of like this mid tier being like, not everything has to be a God of War Ragnarok or a Sea of Stars. There can be like something in the middle.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right too about like, you know, all of these layoffs, that sucks. But also there are probably a ton of talented creative people that were working on remastering The Last of Us for the 5th time that can now go make something original and fun. And so like, what are they going to do? Like there are a bunch of, you know, new like with all of the consolidation in the industry, like you already saw, you know, like who is it that made like Call of Duty originally? Like those guys that spun off and did Titanfall.
Infinity Ward, they
like the two
the
guys
original
that did
Infinity
it,
Ward, they split off and made
Yeah.
Respawn.
And are they still with Respawn? Like the guys who did it initially, or they?
Yeah, at least the one guy is
Okay.
the guy that's like now over that like department of EA. They like made him.
Yeah.
What is his name?
He's
Like he has a famous name in the industry.
Yeah.
And they made him like the head of whatever, which is crazy that even with that being the case and him being like well known, successful, and all that, they still just like canceled a Star Wars game
Mandalorian
under him. Yeah, like or under his studio.
Yeah. But like, you know, like stuff like that. But also I think like a lot of the BioWare guys that were like initially with BioWare have spun off and are making other games. Like Traveler, I think that Traveler game that's coming out. Vince Zampella, yes.
That's who we're
but like
talking
that Traveler game is being made by like ex BioWare devs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when Microsoft bought like Activision Blizzard, you know, there were some people that left Activision and Blizzard or got laid off from Activision and Blizzard that are now going to, you know, like have either spun up their own studios or will be going to other studios. Sony just laid off some people. And so, like I said, I think you'll see a lot of those people maybe like it sucks and I hate it for them, but also you might see them go to some of these smaller studios or spin up their own thing.
Right.
Having seen the consequences of what happens when you just dogmatically stick to making a big AAA game once every 10 years versus, you know, actually putting out stuff more often and focusing on the fun. I think you will see a lot more AA type of games come out. Just with a lot of the talent that is floating around out there due to all of these layoffs, hopefully.
Yeah. That would
Maybe
be
that's
like
a more optimistic take, but
I was going to say that would be like the best possible outcome. And you do see things like that. It's just hard to keep track of it. It happens now. Like there are some ex CD Projekt like Witcher devs that went off and they made a game that I feel like you should try and tell me if it's good because it's slightly more up your alley. No, that Gourd game.
Oh, I do remember Gourd. I have it on my wish list. I just don't think it's gone on sale yet.
It looks pretty cool, but it's like not a genre that I typically like stick with these days. But it's one that I go look at every now and then, and I'm like, maybe I'll because it's like a turn-based kind of game, but it's still that like grimdark vibe to it. So I think you will see, but also unless you like know me and I tell you that, like the average person isn't going to be like, oh, people who made The Witcher made this game, I should check it out. So it's like it's kind of hard to track and be like, oh, the talent that I loved from this studio is now working on this thing, unless they can use it as like advertisement push and they're like,
yeah, it's kind of like
the minds behind The Witcher.
Yeah, it's like when Marvel is advertising a new movie and it's like I never know who is directing it, and then it's like, oh, and Taika Waititi is doing this one, and it's like, oh, okay, I do know who that one is, but 99% of the time don't know who's directing the movie. You know, Sam Raimi and you know, did Multiverse of Madness or whatever, but like I can't tell you who directed The Eternals. I can't tell you who directed Iron Man 2. Like I can't, you know. And so even if you're kind of plugged in to the industry, I think it's hard to like. Back in the day, we had like Cliff Bleszinski and like Jade Raymond and Todd Howard was still kicking it, but
Right.
But now it seems like a lot of like the big ones are tied to one of the big publishers, and you don't get to see, like, unless you're just like a very specific fan of a very specific person, it's hard to necessarily follow some of it.
Yeah. But hopefully, whether you are aware of it or not, we'll see some of the talent from these bigger studios kind of spread out across the industry and give us some exciting AA smaller experiences that we can enjoy, because I love a good AA game, and so the more of them we get, I say the better. So do you have anything that you want to say as we wrap this thing up? Anything else that we haven't mentioned, or you think we're good to roll into housekeeping?
I think we're probably good to roll into housekeeping. If you want to play some AA games, like, go look up some of the ones that we've talked about in this episode, because I don't think you can really go wrong with most of those, like Plague Tale, Remnant, Lies of P, like all very good. Hunt Showdown, I should mention. Go play those.
And taking that into housekeeping, if you want to learn about some of these games before you go check them out, we have episodes on Lies of P, Remnant 2, the Plague Tale games. We did a big old 2-hour deep dive on both of them. We have a ton of Neighborhood Watch episodes where we talk about a bunch more of these games, like Evil West and Wo Long Fallen Dynasty and all these that, they didn't necessarily get their own full dedicated deep dive, but, they live in those Neighborhood Watch episodes. So if you're curious about some of these games that we've mentioned, or games that like fit this description, we have tons of content there. We've got stuff on our YouTube channel as well. Dylan did a Sinking City review back in the day, so if you're interested in that Lovecraft stuff he was talking about,
Sinking City is we have changed styles of how we do reviews since then, but Sinking City, really good. Evil West will be out. When does this come out? Monday?
Yeah, next Monday.
Yeah, so Evil West just recently came out. It should be one of the most recent videos on our channel. Lies of P is on there as well. So if you're looking for like a more bite-sized take on a game, and maybe watch some like gameplay and trailers of it, go check those out on our YouTube channel. There's other stuff on there too that you can, feel free to browse around. But specifically tying to this episode, like, we've got some videos about a lot of the games that we have talked about. I think we did one on Plague Tale. Innocence.
Yes, Innocence.
On there as well, which you should check out. You should go do that one. If nothing else, please play that game.
That was one that we did like together, right? We haven't done one of those in a while where we like both were on the video, but yeah, we do have that one there.
So check those out if you're interested. Even if you're not interested, if you've gotten like an hour and 10 minutes into this episode, you kind of owe it to us to at least go subscribe to our channel. If you haven't, we've given you enough entertainment, hopefully, that you should subscribe, please, but also you should do it. So,
and if you want to let us know what some of your favorite AA games are, or if you're curious and want to learn more about some of the ones we've played and just kind of chat with us about them, that is what our Discord server is for. You can use the link in the podcast description. Come hang out, come talk, come tell us what you think AAs are worth playing. Tell us what you think about if, AAs we're going to see more of them as time goes on. Come in there and recommend some AA games that maybe we haven't played yet, because I'm always on the lookout for a new fun experience. So Discord's a place to do that. We're also on Instagram and TikTok and X and all those great places, but for the most part, like, Discord, that's where we actually like engage and chat and stuff like that. So that's the best place to come hang out. X is just terrible. It's just an awful platform. Like every time I get on there and I like I make the mistake of scrolling, and I'm even in just like a relatively curated like gaming kind of indie creator like space, but it's just like, man, what is? You tap on a couple people that are posting about Final Fantasy, and the next thing you know, you've like welcomed in these just people viciously arguing about Final Fantasy Rebirth for no reason. And I'm like, don't you guys have jobs? What? How do you have this much time to just be this heated arguing about nothing on this app that you apparently all hate?
Exactly. And like, there's no, if you weren't already on X when it was Twitter, it can't be drawing new people. Like, you can't be like, oh, let me go get on X. like,
I just had to say that. All that to say, basically, don't really expect a lot of engagement from me on X, but come to Discord. Come hang out in our Discord. We would love to have you. Cool. Well, that has been our AA episode, Not the Battery, the video game, and we have something I'm really excited about coming down the pipeline for the podcast soon, but I think I'll wait and announce that on our next episode. So until then, thank you all so much for listening.
Impossible to hide.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Friendly Neighborhood Gamers podcast. If so, we would greatly appreciate your help in growing the show and the community by giving us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any other podcasting app that allows it.
We also have some great videos on our YouTube channel, including reviews, rankings, and other topics. We would really appreciate you checking it out. And if you want to keep up with everything going on in the neighborhood, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and feel free to jump in our Discord server.
We hope to see you there. Links for everything are in the podcast description. Thanks again for listening, and remember, stay friendly, gamers.